All rise.
Jury, we're in a moment going to turn to the Commonwealth for its closing argument, and I do want to comment on one aspect of the defense closing argument. You may note that I interrupted Mr. Baez towards the end of his closing as he was discussing reasonable doubt, and that's only because, as I told you at the outset, one of my roles is to be the judge of the law. That is, judges are very protective of their responsibility to state the law, to instruct you on the law. And for purposes of a trial, the judge is the judge of the law. So I have to reserve to myself the responsibility to give you full instructions in this instance as to how to define reasonable doubt, what reasonable doubt means. It's not to suggest that Mr. Baez did anything wrong in his pointing out to you where, in the view of the defense, reasonable doubt may be found in this case. That is perfectly appropriate argument. One other aspect was a reference to the consequences of your verdict, and your verdict being irrevocable, and I'd ask you to disregard any consideration of the consequences of your verdict. Your job is to determine whether, from the evidence presented and the inferences you draw from that evidence, whether the Commonwealth has proved the essential elements of each charged crime beyond a reasonable doubt. If it
It is often said that a picture tells a story. And each and every one of you now know the terrible, the violent, and the senseless story that these four pictures show. Two men's lifeless bodies covered in sheets. Two men who had names, who have names. Daniel D'Abreu and Safiro Furtado. Two men who you know did nothing wrong that night. Two men who you know, despite baseless allegations from a defense attorney, were doing nothing wrong that night. They were doing nothing wrong when they were brutally murdered and killed. Two men who were not drug dealers, drug addicts, gun-toting gang members. You now know from the evidence that these were two men, hard-working immigrants to this country, who were out for a night with their friends to have a good time, who were set upon by a killer who was motivated by an illogical, senseless belief of being disrespected, being tried. A belief that will never, ever, no matter how long this trial were to go, no matter how many pieces of evidence we put before you, it would never make sense, because you cannot fully climb into the mind of a killer. Ladies and gentlemen, this car, these pictures of what was in that car, the carnage in that car, speaks volumes. It speaks a story. Their bodies pierced by 5 devastatingly accurate and deadly gunshots. But you now know from the evidence that not only 5 shots were intended to be fired by that killer. That killer took pleasure in what he did that night. That killer wanted his victims to see it coming. He called their names. And if there's one thing you can take from the know-it-all Dr. Downs, you can take the fact that we agreed with his assessment that Safira Furtado was looking at the shots as they were coming, looking down the barrel of a gun held by a murderer, because that killer wanted him to see it coming. These photographs, ladies and gentlemen, they speak to murder in the first degree and nothing less. 5 bullets shot into that car, killing those men, but more pulls of the trigger than 5. The killer wanted more carnage in that car. He continued to pull the trigger, but the gun was empty. Each pull of that trigger, ladies and gentlemen, think about it. To think, to pull the trigger, to hear the shot, to pull the trigger again, to hear the shot, to know, particularly when you were driving home, that you got one in the head and one in the chest. The killer knew that. Ladies and gentlemen, that screams intent to kill. That screams deliberate premeditation. That screams, these photos scream the crime here and nothing less, murder in the first degree. Safira Furtado, we don't dispute the fact that he was killed instantly. 2 kill shots fired by that man's gun right into his head killed him instantly. But that does not change the fact that he was killed with deliberate premeditation with an intent to kill. It's a different story with Daniel D'Abreu. You now know from the evidence how he died. And let's think about that for a moment, how Daniel D'Abreu died. 2 gunshots to his chest, gunshots ripped through his lungs, through his heart. His chest cavity began to fill up with blood. He breathed in blood. You heard that testimony from the medical examiner. And even though the celebrity know-it-all Dr. Downs says, oh no, he would be unconscious within seconds, Dr. Downs wasn't there. But Rashidi Sanchez was there. Donald Gobin was there. Brian Kwan was there. Rashidi Sanchez told you that he was not unconscious. Rashidi Sanchez told you what his last moments were like. He was trying to speak. He was conscious. He was laboring to breathe, and then he expired. Seconds, 10 seconds, or 60 seconds. Does it really matter when you think about the way that he died? 10 seconds. That was 10 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. So does it really matter whether it was 10 seconds that he lived or was conscious, or 60? He was suffering when he died. And I don't tell you that to upset you. I don't tell you that to shock you. I don't tell you that, as Mr. Baez said, to make you angry. I tell you that because when you hear Judge Locke's instructions later on this afternoon, you will realize it's important. It's important to know how Daniel D'Abreu died. It's important to know whether or not he suffered. It's important to know whether or not the killer took pleasure in the deeds that he had done. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that will be the definition of extreme atrocity or cruelty. A murder committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty, which soon you will know from Justice Locke means murder in the first degree. That's perhaps the easiest part of your deliberations, what the crime is here. Murder in the first degree by deliberate premeditation of both victims, and murder in the first degree by deliberate premeditation and extreme atrocity or cruelty for Daniel D'Abreu. Ladies and gentlemen, about 7 weeks ago, each and every one of you were summoned to jury duty. It was the week of February 14th. There was a snowstorm on the 13th. The court was canceled. Each and every one of you came in and sat through a rather long a selection process to become jurors. And at that time, you knew nothing about this case. About a week later, you were sworn in as jurors. You were chosen by the sides, by agreement, because each and every one of you could be fair, impartial, and objective. Each and every one of you would give this case the attention that it deserves. And you've held that bargain, or you've held that obligation amazingly so. No sick days for you. You were here on time every single day, and as Mr. Baez said, both parties appreciate that. When you came in and the evidence began, you were sworn as jurors. You still knew very little about the case. A few days later, you went on a view. You stood in the very spot where Daniel D'Abreu and Safira Furtado's life literally drained out of their bodies. Stuck in that car, trapped nowhere to run from the killer's bullets. You stood in the spot where it all began. You stood in Club Cure. You walked around Club Cure. You walked to the parking garage. You went all around the area. You actually stood in the spot where the killer car saw the victims and set upon its prey. That was the view. You still knew very little then, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are, 5 weeks later, 70 witnesses later, almost 400 exhibits later. Now you know the truth. Not from anything I say or what Mr. Baez says. You know the truth from the evidence in this case, which speaks loudly and it speaks clearly. You now know the truth of who the killer was that night on July 16, 2012. You also know that that senseless violence did not end on July 16, 2012, but that violence continued 6 months later when the same perpetrator unleashed the same type of violence on the only man who could tell his vicious, awful secret, his former best friend, Alexander Bradley. And ladies and gentlemen, you now know from the evidence that the killer who I speak of sits right before you, Aaron Hernandez. Now, you just heard Mr. Baez's closing argument, much like his opening. Very well said. But think about what Mr. Baez said, and think about the evidence, and how much of what he said was actually supported by the evidence that you heard. And a lot of Mr. Baez's closing argument was about Alexander Bradley, and that's fine. I want to talk about Alexander Bradley with you. But before we do that, just bear with me. I want you to consider, ladies and gentlemen, as if you heard this case and did not hear one word of evidence or testimony from Alexander Bradley about the events of July 16, 2012. What if you only heard evidence from other sources? And what if the only thing you knew from Alexander Bradley came from his presumptive lawsuit he filed for being shot in the face? That's it. Bear with me. Let's go through that evidence if we can. The car. Is there really any doubt what the murder car was in this case? Did Mr. Baez even dispute that just now in his closing argument? Who had the best view of what the murder car was? Donald Gobin and Brian Kwan, right here on Marginal Street. You were there during the viewing. A block away, the silver SUV pulled up right next to them. Brian Kwan, Donald Gobin, they both got a great look at the car. Donald Gobin, in particular, knows cars. He actually said that night either a Toyota 4Runner or a Nissan Pathfinder, Rhode Island plates. That was said that night. Similar descriptions from Brian Kwan as well of the car. The survivors in the car, Mercedes Sanchez and Aquilino Ferrer, they both said silver SUV. You now know without any doubt that the car, the murder car, was a silver 4Runner with Rhode Island plates. You also know that the police and investigators scoured the video. The only car that fits this description coming out of that garage at any relevant time is this car right here. The silver 4Runner Toyota with Rhode Island plates. And there's a license plate. And you also know from the evidence that that's the murder car because you can see it pass by the victims twice that night, just prior to the killing. The first pass you see at 2:18 in the morning. The second pass you see at 2:20 in the morning. You can tell that's the exact same car. You don't need John Green's boards to do that. You've watched enough video during this trial. That is the murder car. You can watch that car pull up and park in the very spot where you stood during the view, the very spot where Mr. Bradley, we'll talk about in a moment, told you where it was parked. You can actually see the signal being put on. And this, again, ladies and gentlemen, is probably one of those blurry images that Mr. Baez refers to. But is this blurry at all? You can see the car park. You can now see the brake lights on. There's no doubt that that silver SUV with the Rhode Island plates parked there. And then later on, is there really any doubt? Here the victim's car is leaving the parking garage. You can see the two blurry figures, as Mr. Baez calls them, now walking back to that SUV. You see the victim's car pull out. And it's not coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, it's evidence what happens next. You will see that silver SUV pull out of that spot. You see the lights come on. Again, it's not blurry. You don't have to be a video expert to know what you see. You can see that car pull out and follow behind the victim car. And there it is. Right behind the car is Safiro Furtado, Daniel D'Abreu, and the other victims. The car is now in pursuit. And who is in that car? You know exactly who's in that car, ladies and gentlemen. Aaron Hernandez was driving at that point, at least initially, and Alexander Bradley's in the passenger seat. Again, we're considering the evidence as if you never heard a word from Alexander Bradley, so keep thinking about that as we go through this. Who's in that car? Aaron Hernandez, Alexander Bradley. No doubt. And then this is a video that Mr. Baez just mentioned in his closing. The video that maybe you were wondering during the trial, why did I keep showing it to you? Why did I keep using the magnifying feature on Windows Media to show you this video over and over again? Why does Mr. Baez not want to talk about this video? Why does Mr. Baez keep calling this a blurry video? Watch it, ladies and gentlemen. If there's one favor that Alexander Bradley did that night, it was the clothing that he chose that he was going to wear and Aaron Hernandez was going to wear. Remember, he let him borrow clothing? Is there any doubt from that video that I just played that you can see Alexander Bradley's yellow shirt? You can see Aaron Hernandez's gray shirt. You can even see the white insignia. It's not blurry. Look at the white. You can see the gray on white. Look at how tall he is. He's as tall as Bradley. Look at the white sneakers. Is this the mysterious woman, the 6-foot-tall woman with the braids that Mr. Bradley somehow picked up in the middle of the night and ditched Aaron Hernandez and went and did the murder? I mean, that's what Mr. Baez is asking you to believe. This is evidence that Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley are in that car. And here's them leaving. Alexander Bradley's shirt, the gray shirt right in front of him, Aaron Hernandez. You're going to notice something very common in these videos I show you. There's always a certain person who's always leading the way. First person to walk in the club, first person to walk out of the club, first person to walk just about everywhere. And guess who that is? Aaron Hernandez. Because he makes the decisions. He was the leader that night. And he was the one who pulled that gun and killed those men. And as if you need to see it again, here's still photographs. Blurry? You can see the gray with the white. You can see Alexander Bradley's yellow shirt. Is there really any doubt? You can even see the baseball hat. Is there really any doubt that those two blurry, shadowy figures that Mr. Baez keeps referring to, is there any doubt that that's Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley? And if you accept that that's Alexander Bradley and Aaron Hernandez, they get into that murder car right after the victims pull out, and then they follow behind. And you know what happens after that. And there's more. That car, who does that car come back to? The license plate, Fox Toyota. A car leased to Aaron Hernandez. Should that surprise you? And again, we're pretending we haven't heard a word from Alexander Bradley. Keep that in mind as we go through this. Where's that car found? Is that murder car found at Alexander Bradley's cousin's house? Is that car found, the murder car found, at the closest relative that Alexander Bradley has? Oh no, that murder car is found stuffed away in the garage of the house of a relative who he trusts more than anybody. You heard the evidence from various sources how much he loved Tanya Cummings Singleton, his aunt. I believe the sister said she was like a mother to him, a second mother. And where is that murder car found stuffed away? In that garage, you can't see through the windows, collecting cobwebs, stuck in that car. And that does not seem like a really wealthy family that lives at that house. You think that if they had cars, a nice 2007 or 2006 Toyota 4Runner, they wouldn't want to use it. But you know that car was never used again. Jennifer Mercado told you that was garaged about a year ago, July of 2012. No one's used it since. The battery's gone dead. It's collecting cobwebs. But guess what? The inside of that car is plenty clean because Aaron Hernandez made sure that his cousin cleaned it well. And you've heard evidence of that. Who lives at that address? Tanya Cummings Singleton, his closest relative. T.L. Singleton, the man who you know from the evidence, became close to Aaron as well. That's where he stuffed the murder car. What connection does Alexander Bradley have to that? You think Tanya Cummings Singleton and T.L. Singleton are going to hide a murder car for Alexander Bradley? Seriously? Again, we don't have to go over and over it again. That is the car used in the murder. There is no doubt about that. That car is tied to one man and one man only, Aaron Hernandez. But there's more. The very next day, July 17th, 2012, what does Aaron Hernandez do? He rents a car. Of course, Shayana Jenkins would lead you to believe, oh, it's no big deal. We just rent cars all the time. Just on a random Tuesday, we're going to rent a car. Despite the fact that you have the black Range Rover, you have the silver Toyota SUV, the 4Runner, that she said she drove too, suddenly it just disappears. But Shayana, remember, she doesn't ask any questions. She knows her role. The car just disappears, and he rents a car the next day. Guess what that's called? Consciousness of guilt. That's evidence. And there's more. The murder weapon. Did you notice in Mr. Baez's entire 1 hour and 25-minute closing, he didn't mention one thing about the murder weapon? Not one thing. You know what the murder weapon is, and you know where it was found. There's the murder weapon. Think about this. Jaylene Diaz-Ramos, June 21st, 2013. Now, doesn't that date seem rather interesting and convenient? Just as the police were starting to converge at 114 Lake Avenue, you heard evidence from Trooper Donovan that a search warrant was executed on the 26th of June, 2013 at 114 Lake Avenue. So here we are, 5 days prior to that, and the murder weapon is on the move. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting who is found with the murder weapon? Jaylene Diaz-Ramos, a young woman from guess where? Bristol, Connecticut. A young woman who you now know has ties to guess where? 114 Lake Avenue, where the murder car was held. 114 Lake Avenue, which is like a second home to Aaron Hernandez. Jaylene Diaz-Ramos' best friend in the world, the man she grew up with, John Alcorn, also known as Chicago. Who's his cousin? Close cousin, T.L. Singleton. Where did they grow up? The exact same house of their grandparents on 275 Sandstrom Road in Bristol, Connecticut. Who is T.L. Singleton married to? Tanya Singleton. Who's the closest relative to Tanya Singleton, the person who he trusts more than anybody and he's closest to? Tanya Singleton, Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez, John Alcorn had been to 114 Lake Avenue. You heard from Jennifer Mercado, he had been there. Obviously, T.L. Singleton lives at 114 Lake Avenue. Tanya Singleton lives at 114 Lake Avenue. And Aaron Hernandez spends an awful lot of time at 114 Lake Avenue. The murder weapon is linked to Aaron Hernandez. The murder car is linked to Aaron Hernandez. There is no link to any of these people to Alexander Bradley. So again, does the defense want you to believe that Alexander Bradley does the murder, but he convinces Aaron Hernandez to hide the murder weapon with his relatives, who would later give it to some woman who's trying to move it when she gets pulled over and she gets caught after a car accident?
Object, Judge, to counsel arguing facts that are not in evidence under the people testify.
I'll see you at sidebar. Nor you, during your deliberations, may speculate. You may draw reasonable inferences, but you may not speculate or engage in conjecture. And as it relates to the evidence presented in this case, please understand there is no evidence showing that the defendant, Mr. Hernandez, directed anyone at 114 Lake Ave or anywhere else to move a gun in or around June of 2013. and to conclude that the defendant directed someone to do so would be engaging in speculation. That would not be permitted. Mr. Hagan, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. So as I stated, Aaron Hernandez, the defendant, you can connect him to the murder car, not Alexander Bradley. Aaron Hernandez, you can connect to the murder weapon, not Alexander Bradley. But there's more. Interactions with the victims. Now, this was another part of Mr. Baez's closing that, although he mentioned Mr. Ojimba, it's very interesting that he didn't mention all of Mr. Ojimba's testimony. Well, first you have the victims and Aaron Hernandez walking into Club Cure together. And then here we are downstairs. Remember how many times you have to look at this photograph? Remember Ojimba's testimony. And Mr. Baez suggests he's biased for the Commonwealth because he works at Cure. Do you remember his testimony? He doesn't even work at Cure anymore. So Mr. Ojimba, Ugo Ojimba testifies. Remember what he testified to. And talk about a witness with no dog in the fight. A witness who just came in and told what he remembered, right? And he testified in the grand jury. Mr. Ojimba testified that he saw an interaction between the defendant and the victims, the two people who he later saw in the car, dead, riddled with bullets. He saw an interaction, and it wasn't just any interaction. Remember what he said? Something about it caught my attention. Now, granted, at the end, he concluded, you'll remember that testimony, that there was nothing going on and there was not going to be any hostile interaction. But initially, it caught his attention. And also remember what Mr. Ojimba said about the makeup or where the positioning was. Aaron Hernandez was having a conversation or some type of encounter that caught his attention with, guess who? The man with the braids, the person we now know as Daniel D'Abreu. And where was the man with Aaron Hernandez? Over his left shoulder. Not part of the conversation. And then Mr. D'Abreu had one of his friends nearby, and maybe a third, I think, was a testimony. Your memory obviously controls on that. But isn't that a compelling, important piece of evidence in this case? Doesn't that indicate that there was some encounter between the defendant and the victims in this case? Doesn't that almost knock out of the park all this nonsense about whether or not this could have happened in 9 minutes? And very quickly on that, Mr. Baez suggests to you that the Commonwealth and the police hid Jamie Furtado from you and hid the fact that there was a photograph taken with a fan? Seriously? Who put Jamie Furtado on as a witness? We did. Jamie Furtado even testified in the grand jury. Jamie Furtado testified on direct examination to taking a photograph with a fan. That was hidden from you? Because the police didn't figure out who the fan was and get the actual photograph from his phone? That really matters? That makes a difference? That makes the police investigation corrupt? That makes the prosecution corrupt? Seriously? So think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Ojimba, he has the interaction between the defendant and the victims. That's evidence, and that's important evidence. I have one moment now. And then what about this, ladies and gentlemen? Exhibit 275. Mr. Baez put something out similar to this. Aaron Hernandez leaves in 9 minutes. Nobody disputes that. But Mr. Baez acts like that's actually a good thing for the defense. So that's a thing that should cause some reasonable doubt. Remember Jeff London's testimony? He said it was very unusual for Aaron Hernandez to go into a bar, the Club Cure, and leave in 9 minutes. There had to be a reason he left so quickly. And you know that reason because of the encounter he had with the victims. And Mr. Baez, again, makes it seem helpful that he's downing 2 drinks. Why is he downing 2 drinks as he's walking out of the door? Why not finish the 2 drinks downstairs? He didn't finish the drinks downstairs because something happened downstairs that caused him to leave. That is more evidence suggesting his guilt in this case. Ladies and gentlemen, what the additional evidence, the description of the shooter. Mercedes Sanchez.
The guys come, pull over, and said nigga or something like that.
Can you see in the car? Can you see into the car that pulls up next to you?
Yeah, because I'm sitting in the back seat, like on the right,
Okay. Behind the passenger seat?
behind the Safety.
Okay.
And then I said that I see the car, like the white guy with had like
What color hat?
who said the car.
No, his hat. What color is his hat?
There's a lot of color, like I think it's maybe white and something like the design is different, like.
Okay. And
Mercedes Sanchez, arguably the best view of anybody in that car. Think about it. He's on the side closest to the shooter car. He's right there. He sees better than anybody. What description does he give to the police? You heard it. A man with a white hat. A white guy. A white guy. Aaron Hernandez, you heard, is half white. His mother's Italian. His father was Hispanic. Aaron Hernandez looks like a white male. Would anybody really, and Mr. Baez may have said that certain people when he was shot in the face thought he was light-skinned and white, but would you ever look at Alexander Bradley's facial features and think he's a white man? Really? White man was the shooter. And what about the hat description? White with color on it. Who does that look like?
you see any hair at all hanging out from under the hat? It's a white guy. No facial hair.
No what?
No facial hair. He doesn't have anything on his face.
No, nothing face.
Is his face? Is it fat? Is it round? Is it
Like skinny.
skinny?
Yeah.
No facial hair. Look who has no facial hair. Aaron Hernandez. Look who does have facial hair. Alexander Bradley. Shooter's face. Skinny. Who has a skinny face? Who had back then a kind of round, almost fat face?
You see any hair at all?
Nari's close up again. Looks like a white male with a thin, skinny face. And yes, you can see the beads. Mr. Baez can mock that, but you know those are actually braided beads on his shirt, over his shirt. What is the evidence that there is of a female in the car? Really, let's talk about that real quickly. So the only evidence of a female in the car comes from Brian Kwan, but not his trial testimony. He told you he doesn't remember what the shooter looked like. It could have been a man, could have been a woman. And that makes sense because Brian Kwan didn't get a good look at the passenger. Brian Kwan's in the lower car. He's looking up at an SUV. He sees a figure there. And he said it could have been a man, could have been a woman. And Mr. Baez pointed out that back in 2012 he mentioned something about braids or something to that effect. But think about it. If Brian Kwan is looking up into that window and Aaron Hernandez is leaning over like this, trying to figure out if this is a car with the people he wants to shoot, you don't think that those beads braided like that could look like braids? And what's the only other evidence of women? Again, the defense theory that Alexander Bradley picks up some woman, dumps off Aaron Hernandez, and commits the murder? Seriously? The other evidence of a woman comes from Aquilino Freire, who didn't even see the shooter, didn't even see the gun. And he said, well, I may have seen a woman in the passenger seat. But again, that's not what he really testified to, was it? And then the only other evidence of a woman, this is the most absurd evidence of all the defense is asking you to find reasonable doubt in, from the street sweeper who comes after the fact. The shooting's already happened. Aquilino Freire has fallen out of the car. It's already happened, and he sees an SUV with a woman calling 911 or filming it. That's not somebody involved in the case. Even Mr. McMaster told you that. That's somebody who comes after the fact and is witnessing it. This whole woman thing, it's a red herring.
You see any?
There's more evidence, again, without Alexander Bradley, the cell tower records. Cell tower records put him in Boston right at the time the murder starts, 12:13. 1:13, right there on Stewart Street, right near Club Cure. .213, we're talking 20 minutes before the murder now. Right there, still, near Club Cure. And then this one, probably the most important one of all. 2:37. Again, if there was any doubt whether or not Aaron Hernandez is in the murder car at the time of the murder, it's gone now, isn't it? 5 minutes after the murder happens, 2:32 is the time of the call. Here is his phone, Aaron Hernandez's. Guess who he's calling? Shayana Jenkins, his fiance. 17-second phone call, and the car, as you know, is on the move. The car is clearly, from the evidence, traveling down the Massachusetts Turnpike. There it is. Call starts here on this part of the pike. Westbound, there it is, the call ends. Again, Shayana Jenkins Hernandez, has no memory of that phone call. She also apparently doesn't have any memory of the phone call earlier in the night that you'll see on the tower records. That was for about 2 minutes and 37 seconds. But again, she's in Florida. She doesn't remember anything. We'll get into Shayana Jenkins Hernandez in a moment. Then, Newton. West Newton, still heading westbound. Then this point, clearly, they take a turn up north on 95, 128. Then they head back down. Is that indicative of getting lost? That's up to you to decide. And here we go. They're on the road to Connecticut. Manchester, Connecticut, 4:40 in the morning. And then finally, where do they end up, ladies and gentlemen? Again, this is Aaron Hernandez's phone, not Alexander Bradley's. Is there any question he's in that car? The defense would have you believe he's still out in, up near Club Cure, hanging out, walking around with people in the W Hotel. Really? Is that what the evidence shows? No. He's at 47 Newberry Street, the address of Brooke Wilcox. And guess what happens then? You now know, and it will be a common pattern that you'll see in this case. Aaron Hernandez's phone goes dark. Off network. Consistent with being shut off or being out of battery, whatever it is, but the phone goes dark. And there's more evidence. Brooke Wilcox. You decide credibility. But wasn't Brooke Wilcox one of the most important witnesses in this case? Didn't you find Brooke Wilcox's testimony to make sense? Didn't Brooke Wilcox seem to come up with no axe to grind, with no dog in the fight? Yes, she knows Alexander Bradley. Yes, she has a child with Alexander Bradley. But did she seem like she was just going with what he said? Didn't she say things that were a little different than Alexander Bradley said? Brooke Wilcox. But think about what her testimony was. Again, pretending you never heard from Alexander Bradley. Brooke Wilcox, 5 o'clock in the morning, or thereabouts, suddenly Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley show up at her house. Aaron Hernandez is pacing around. Alexander Bradley's acting nervous. Alexander Bradley says words to her to the effect of, that crazy MRFer just did some effed up shit. And then what happens? The internet search. Is Brooke Wilcox going to just make that up? Does Brooke Wilcox have any idea when she gives that statement that there can be a forensic download of the computer that can corroborate that? In fact, Brooke Wilcox thinks that the computer can never again have any data recovered because of the work she had done on it. But what does this show? This is corroboration. And guess what? It's a Chrome search. And I know this question was never allowed to be answered, but ladies and gentlemen, you're allowed to use your common sense, your life experience.
Overruled.
You're allowed to use your common sense, your life experience. You don't need to be a computer nerd to know this. Everybody uses the same browser. You get used to it. I'm a dinosaur. I've been using Internet Explorer for years. Everyone uses a certain browser, ladies and gentlemen. So doesn't it make sense that Brooke Wilcox said the same thing to you? I always use Internet Explorer. It was only after my computer was broken that I ended up using Chrome. Who's using Chrome at 7:15 in the morning? Aaron Hernandez, that's who. And that corroborates Brooke Wilcox's testimony. And what about what happens next? A familiar face, ladies and gentlemen, Tanya Cummings Singleton, the closest, most trusted relative of Aaron Hernandez. Suddenly, she shows up in her kitchen, whispering with Aaron Hernandez. And you have a phone call, 9 minutes long. Again, Aaron Hernandez is clever in this part, ladies and gentlemen. He actually used Alexander Bradley's phone to make the call. 9 minutes to Tanya Cummings Singleton. You really think Alexander Bradley's going to be talking to Tanya Cummings Singleton?
Arguing facts not in evidence?
I'll see you in sidebar. Mr. Hagan.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard the testimony. Remember from Brooke Wilcox. Again, we're going to pretend we didn't hear a thing from Alexander Bradley. Brooke Wilcox, Aaron Hernandez yells out to her, "What's the address here?" as he's on the phone. Who do you think Aaron Hernandez is on the phone with? He shows up a short time later, but Tanya Cummings Singleton. And there's more. There's Jack Fox, ladies and gentlemen. What about Jack Fox? You heard his testimony. It's more about the silver SUV, the 4Runner. Jack Fox tells you that all of a sudden, after May, that car is never brought in again. Before that, Aaron Hernandez was pretty religious about bringing it in when he was told to. But suddenly the car disappears after May. And Jack Fox tells you, ladies and gentlemen, that he tries to get the car back. He even offers Aaron Hernandez a better car. Remember, Hoyer was leaving the Patriots. I had a better car to swap out for him. I even sent some of my people up to the dealership. But Aaron Hernandez never let anyone get access to that car. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because it was hidden away at Tanya Cummings Singleton's garage collecting cobwebs. And here was a very interesting part of Jack Fox's testimony, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, he told you about a conversation he had where he learned that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, wanted to buy the car because, quote, he liked it so much. Jack Fox said he was there in August 4th. This is just a couple of weeks after the murder, and the 4Runner's not there. He wants to buy the car because he likes it so much. Really? It's in a garage collecting cobwebs, battery going dead. He likes it so much? No. That is a lie, ladies and gentlemen. That is a lie for the defendant to cover his tracks. And this isn't the biggest piece of evidence of all, again, without Alexander Bradley telling you anything about the murders on July 15, 2012. What happens in February of 2013? The most devastating evidence of all against the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, for the murders. Think about it. A year's gone, not a year, I'm sorry, 6 months has gone by. The police aren't on to him. But you know from Jeff London, he's getting more and more paranoid, isn't he? He's calling him the feds, those types of things. He's paranoid. There's only one person who can unleash that secret and hold him accountable for what he did in July. That one person is Alexander Bradley. And you learned, and again, this is Alexander Bradley, what he would testify to in his Florida shooting, that the night before February 13th, 2013, the night before, that's that interaction. Do you remember that testimony? When Alexander Bradley tells you, Aaron Hernandez, those guys are looking at me, it's funny, they must be cops. Alexander Bradley turns to him, well, if they are cops, it's probably because of the effed up stuff you did up in Boston. And Aaron Hernandez gave him a look. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly when Aaron Hernandez decided Alexander Bradley could no longer be trusted. And talk about evidence that he committed the murders. The one eyewitness basically tells you, hey, by the way, I still know that thing. And what happens 24 hours later? You know what happens 24 hours later. But before we even get to what happens 24 hours later, what happens at midnight the next day. You saw the cell phone records for Aaron Hernandez from down in Florida, the 203 number. His phone, once again, goes dark at midnight. Off network. Completely off network until about 7 in the morning. Isn't that interesting? Again, your common sense, your life experience. Who goes out to a club nowadays without your cell phone? How many times have each and every one of you life experiences when your cell phone's out of juice, you'll stop at a convenience store to get a car charger if you have to. You'll borrow someone's charger. Aaron Hernandez just goes without a phone the entire night that he goes out clubbing with his friends? Seriously? 24 hours after making that comment, Alexander Bradley ends up with a bullet in his head, right between his eyes. 24 hours after making the comment to him, a bullet in his head, right between his eyes. I know this picture is disturbing. I don't put it up to upset you. I put it up because it looks like Alexander Bradley is dead, doesn't it? And isn't that important, ladies and gentlemen? Because if he looks like this now, after the surgery, imagine what he looked like at the scene. Aaron Hernandez thought he was dead when he pushed him out of that car. Dead men tell no tales. Aaron Hernandez thought the last liability, the last thing that could hold him accountable for murdering those two men in July of 2012 was now dead. But he wasn't, was he? And the evidence that Aaron Hernandez committed that shooting of Alexander Bradley in the face in Florida comes not only from Alexander Bradley, does it? Mr. Baez made fun of them, all the people from Belglade. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, witnesses are so bad, they're actually good. And that's what those Belglade witnesses were like, weren't they? Belglade, it's obviously known for producing professional football players. There's probably something in the water as well that gives people convenient amnesia, doesn't it? Isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen? You heard evidence from all of the people who testified from Belglade. You learned that they all testified in the grand jury. Not one of them needed immunity in the grand jury. And the most important of those witnesses is Tyrone Crawford. And again, Mr. Baez makes him out to be, drugged out. He didn't say anything about being drugged out like that in the grand jury, did he? You heard his grand jury testimony read to him, or he read it to Mr. Lee, back and forth. That comes in for all purposes. That is evidence. And what did he say back in 2014 in the grand jury? Didn't Tyrone Crawford completely corroborate everything Alexander Bradley told you about the night of the shooting? The only difference, really, is that he puts this mysterious fifth figure in the car, some guy named Soldier. That fifth figure may account for the fifth bill or the fifth entrance fee to get up to the next level. But whether or not that's true, that's up to you based on the evidence. But what did he tell you? He told you the second night, 2 nights at Tootsie's, the second night it's only the small group of them. And it's Aaron Hernandez, it's Jarrell Pierre, JPD, driving. He gives the exact seating position that Alexander Bradley gave you. What does that mean? And then again, he comes up here, the fake amnesia, doesn't remember anything, has to have it read to him. If anything, again, he was so bad, he was good. Wasn't it obvious he was just saying he didn't remember anything so he wouldn't be a snitch? Wasn't that obvious? Your common sense, your life experience. Oscar Hernandez, again, had to be immunized. Kind of just laid out the scene. He wasn't out with them that night, but wasn't it interesting that he didn't testify or remember anything about a gun? He had to be, again, impeached, or actually his grand jury testimony had to be read in, that he did, in fact, bring a gun to Deontay Thompson in the hotel. That corroborates Alexander Bradley. That puts at least one gun, a semi-automatic, in the mix. One of the guns that could have been used to shoot Alexander Bradley in the face. Deontay Thompson, again, he conveniently left out the gun, but other than that, just background. But then there's this JPD, Jarrell Pierre. Isn't it interesting how Mr. Baez turned that around in his closing? He makes it seem as if these are just random friends of Deontay Thompson, no connection to him, and they must be the ones who shot Alexander Bradley. Really? Alexander Bradley identifies Jarrell Pierre as the driver of the car. Alexander Bradley didn't even know his name. You heard him. He said JP, JD, something like that. Doesn't even know his name. And he identifies him as the driver of the car. And think about the corroboration of that. JPD, who again had very interesting amnesia, didn't he? He doesn't remember a thing. He doesn't even remember when he got shot. That's believable. JPD doesn't even remember what his phone number was back then. But we proved what his phone number was in this case, didn't we? That 404 number. And think about the cell records that you received for that 404 number. It completely tracks the night that Bradley was shot. It puts him at the hotel in West Palm Beach. It puts him at Tootsie's, leaving Tootsie's at 5, coming up the highway. And then the most interesting cell tower hit happens at about 6:45, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And where does that tower hit? Right in between the scene where Alexander Bradley is shot and the West Palm Beach Hotel. And then another interesting piece of evidence from the cell towers. When finally the defendant, Aaron Hernandez's cell towers, pop back on, when he comes back online at about 7-something in the morning, guess who's at the same tower as him? Jarrell Pierre, JPD. And again, the defense would have you believe that JPD is just a friend of Deontay's. Really? Look at this. You have the phone records from Aaron Hernandez, his cell phone. Contact JPD. They seem to be pretty friendly, don't they? From March 30th, 2013 until May 31st, 2013, 70 text messages between them. 70 text messages. And Jarrell Pierre doesn't seem to have any problem remembering when he was shot in these text messages. He's talking about it to Aaron Hernandez. I was just shot 2 weeks ago. It's a friendly relationship. He's talking to Aaron Hernandez about his shoulder surgery, too. They're friendly. And these are just the text messages we have. Keep in mind, the cell phone that Aaron Hernandez had when he shot Alexander Bradley has never been found. It's lost. Similarly, the iPhone 4 that Aaron Hernandez had during the murders in July of 2012, that's also mysteriously lost, never to be found. What does that tell you? And then, if you need any more evidence that Aaron Hernandez shot Alexander Bradley down in Florida, how about the defendant's own words, his own hands? You probably didn't even notice when I put this up on the screen, when we introduced the medical records of significance, the phone number for St. Mary's Medical Center. Why is that important? Because Alexander Bradley told you one of the first phone calls he made, you now know probably after the phone call to Robert Lindsay, one of the first phone calls he made when he woke up out of surgery, and the detectives finally left him alone, was to the man who just shot him. The man he thought was one of his best friends. And he told me he called him again and again and again. And that Aaron Hernandez hung up the phone on him. He would tell him, hey, I'm alive, I'm going to kill you. And the phone would be hung up. Look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 phone calls from St. Mary's Hospital, Alexander Bradley, to Aaron Hernandez. And Aaron Hernandez wants you to believe this is his best friend. Some random drug dealers from Florida shoot your best friend in the face, and you just fly off to do your shoot. You fly off to do your muscle milk thing. You fly off. You don't do anything. You hang up on your best friend. No, you hang up because you're shocked. You thought you killed him. He called you and told you he was alive. That's why these are hang-ups. And what's important about these phone calls from Aaron Hernandez that show his lies? What about what happens next? What about the phone calls and the text messages with Aaron Hernandez and Brooke Wilcox? Remember, they start on the 13th, the very day that Alexander Bradley is shot. When Aaron Hernandez thinks Alexander Bradley is dead, he's calling Brooke, and he's setting up his alibi. You heard it. He's playing Mickey the Dunce. Oh, Brooke, where's Alex? I don't know where he is. Jeez, I got to get on this plane. I think he went off with some girl or something. I don't know where he is. He knew exactly where he was. He thought he was dead. He was setting up his alibi. But think about it. These text messages, these phone calls between Brooke and Aaron, they go on. They go on to a point where it goes into the 16th of July. Clearly, at some point, Aaron Hernandez knows from the phone calls he's gotten from Alexander Bradley that you just saw in the hospital records. He knows Alexander Bradley's alive and at a hospital. Does he ever say to Brooke, hey, I did finally get in touch with Alex. Someone shot him in the face and he's down at the hospital. No, he doesn't do that. Why? Because he's still setting up an alibi. Even now he knows he hasn't succeeded. He didn't kill Alexander Bradley. Alexander Bradley's going to survive. He still thinks Alexander Bradley is going to stick to the street code. He's hoping Alexander Bradley's just going to work it out and not say who shot him. So he's setting up his alibi with Brooke Wilcox. Isn't that pretty compelling evidence, ladies and gentlemen? Right from his own mouth, from his own fingers dialing the phone or texting. Is there really any doubt who shot Alexander Bradley in the face and why he shot him in the face? And then there's Shayana Jenkins Hernandez. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I've put her in a category of another witness who's so bad she was good, wasn't she? Shayana Jenkins Hernandez, who actually took the stand and told you, here is a college-educated, incredibly articulate, clearly intelligent woman who tells you she asks no questions. She knows her role. She cooks and she cleans. Did we do a time warp back to the 1950s? Seriously? There's another role you now know that Shayana Jenkins has from her testimony. She covers for Aaron Hernandez and the violent deeds that he committed in this case. She tells you she doesn't even know he was in Costa Rica. She's 5 months pregnant with their first child. They've moved in together, and she wants you to believe she has no idea he's in Costa Rica. She doesn't even remember she's in Florida, doesn't remember a phone call at 2:37 in the morning. Didn't talk about any of the phone calls they had earlier that night that were over 2 minutes. Oh, but that's right, she doesn't ask any questions, does she? But does that make sense? She doesn't ask any questions, but yet she can give somebody a look and they know what it's about. She saw a gun in the house. And remember her testimony on the gun? At first she's outraged. She has a child on the way. Doesn't want, or at that point I think the child had been born. Doesn't want a gun in the house. But then the next answer she's saying, well, a gun's not a big deal because, you know, you can use it for protection. Really? Did any of her testimony make sense? Wasn't she, again, a witness who was so bad, she was good, she so clearly was trying to cover for Aaron Hernandez? What about the tattoos? She wants you to believe that something that's permanently on her hip, presumably for the rest of her life, she has no idea what it says? It's a love poem that she picked out for the defendant and her, and she doesn't know what's on her hip? You believe that? And as if it couldn't have gotten worse, what about the whopper of a lie that she told at the end of her testimony, ladies and gentlemen, when she actually is trying to give him an alibi for the time of the murders? On July 16, 2012, I remember that date. Yes, I definitely remember that date. I don't remember anything else, and I don't ask any questions, but I remember that date, and I know we spent the night in a hotel in Plainville. Really? Don't the phone records clearly show that Aaron Hernandez is still in Hartford, Connecticut on the 16th until about 7 o'clock at night? Doesn't his phone stay dead until it pops back up on the 19th of July, and he's still down in Bristol? Those phone records prove that that was a lie. And what about what Shayana Jenkins Hernandez told you about Alexander Bradley's shooting? Seriously? Does this strain credibility or what? She says he's one of Aaron's best friends. She gives us that, right? Or gives you that. But he all of a sudden disappears. Aaron Hernandez never says a word to her about it. Never says a word to her about him being shot in the face. She learns from the street. And then, oh, I may have had a conversation with him, but I don't really remember what he said. Well, yeah, he told me he was with him, but I don't mean with him when he got shot. I mean generally with him. Seriously? Does any of that testimony make sense? And then, as if you needed more evidence, and this is, again, without Alexander Bradley uttering a word to you from that stand about the murders from 2012, the tattoos. Something else that Mr. Baez didn't really say anything about other than we're leaping to conclusions. The tattoos. Think about it. 6 months after the murders, 1.5 months after Bradley's shot. Remember, you know the date of these tattoos is about March 30th, 2013. What does Aaron Hernandez do? He goes to a tattoo artist and gets this. The cylinder of a revolver with 5 bullets and 1 empty chamber. Random? Does it mean anything? Why on earth would somebody ask for 1 chamber to be empty? What possible explanation can you possibly think of for that tattoo? And Mr. Baez in cross-examination, oh, Rihanna has a tattoo, and someone else has a tattoo. Any tattoos with just 5 bullets and 1 empty cylinder? Especially when you now know, ladies and gentlemen, that 5 is a very important number. That Michael Haig tells you that 5 shots at least were fired in that car. That's the only evidence he knows is 5 shots. You later learn from Alexander Bradley 5 shots. 5 is very important. 5 shots. 5 injuries to those deceased victims, Mr. Furtado, Mr. Diabreu. You think it's random that the defendant chose 5 bullets in that gun with 1 empty cylinder? Really? And what's right above that? The words God forgives. That is not random. That is not art. That is evidence. That is consciousness of guilt. And I would go so far, ladies and gentlemen, that is a confession to what he had done.
Overruled.
That's what the murder weapon looks like with 5 bullets in it. It's pretty close, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Can't you make a reasonable inference that when Aaron Hernandez has his tattoo put on, whether he's memorializing it, getting a trophy, or whatever, why he's doing it, asking for forgiveness, whatever it is, look at that. Doesn't that look the same? Isn't he indicating what he saw in that gun, either before he fired it or after he fired it? That is not random, ladies and gentlemen. That is evidence. That is a statement of guilt. And Mr. Baez may have made an issue about the cylinder being in the wrong way. This is a defendant who you learned his car ran out of gas and he called technicians. Do you really think there was an issue as to whether or not he may have had the cylinder the wrong way? But he not only admitted and had consciousness of guilt and confessed to the murders in 2012 through those tattoos, he's admitting to doing something else too, isn't he? The very same tattoo day, that very same session, what does he get? A semi-automatic pointing right at your face. And remember, David Nelson, the tattoo artist, said he wanted it pointing, like looking straight ahead, as if it's coming at your face. And 1 smoking shell casing and a smoking gun. What does that remind you of, ladies and gentlemen? Something that may have happened about a month and a half prior. Alexander Bradley shot right between the eyes. When he woke up, what did he tell you? First thing I saw, the barrel of the gun right in my face before I was shot. 1 shell casing on the ground. God forgives. That's a confession. That's conscious of guilt. Meaning of the tattoos? You've seen the pictures. We don't have to go through them. How many of those tattoos were dedicated to his father, who was obviously very special to him? All over his body, tattoos that mean things. Sayings that are important to him. Sayings of his father. You can go through the pictures, and almost every single tattoo, you're probably going to be able to figure out the special meaning based upon the evidence you've heard. Again, Shanna Jenkins Hernandez, oh, I don't know, some mean something, some don't. Really? Don't take my word for it. Take his word for it. They all got a lot of meaning. No, Miss Jenkins Hernandez, not some of them occasionally have some meaning. All of them have a lot of meaning. They all have a lot of meaning. And guess what? Those gun tattoos, they had a lot of meaning too. They had a lot of meaning to the things he was admitting that he did through those tattoos. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is the case. Think about it. What I just went through for the past, I don't know how long I've been speaking, but that was the evidence without Alexander Bradley. Without him telling you a thing about what happened in July of 2012. You can convict the car. You can link the defendant to the car. You can link the defendant to the murder weapon. You can link the defendant to an interaction with the victims. He fits a description of the shooter by the closest eyewitness. You can place him at the scene of the crime, fleeing in the SUV, both through the cell records and from the video. He disposes of evidence, the cell phone, the murder weapon, the car. He tries to kill the only eyewitness to the crime, and there's a tattoo confession. If that was the entire case that you heard, and I stood up in front of you, couldn't I stand here with a straight face and tell you, you should convict Aaron Hernandez because the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he did this crime? Couldn't I? Yes, I could. But you have Alexander Bradley. Even though you don't necessarily need him, you have him. So let's talk about Alexander Bradley, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You saw him on that witness stand for 3 straight days. You saw him subject to cross-examination from a skilled defense attorney. You have your God-given common sense, your life experience. You know when people are telling the truth. You know when they're not. I'll just give you some helpful hints as you evaluate Mr. Bradley's testimony. Think about what he said, the circumstances of what he said, how he said it, and is it corroborated through independent sources. Just very quickly on a couple of things with Mr. Bradley, I'm going to give you another statement that may help. Good faith, inconsistencies, and mistakes are the hallmark of credibility, both of a witness and of the investigation. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, think about it. When everything fits too nicely, when a bunch of people say exactly the same thing, doesn't that make you a little suspicious? Don't you know enough about human nature that when everything is just perfect, everyone says the same things? It almost fits into one of Mr. Baez's conspiracy theories. Instead, don't you know from your own life experience that not everyone sees things the same way? You've heard from Justice Locke in the middle of the trial. You'll hear from him again at the end when he gives an instruction on identification, that human beings aren't video recorders. And think about it. Mr. Bradley said this during his testimony. Mr. Baez brought it up when he said, you can be truthful but not accurate. Mr. Baez makes fun of that, but that's actually a pretty important thing to think about. And we had an incredible illustration of it in the middle of the trial, if you think about it, completely unscripted. Remember the testimony of Mr. Mingle and Mr. Riddle? Again, I don't think any side would contest that they were being forthright and truthful in what they saw. If anything, they were more helpful to the defense because Mr. Bradley told me he didn't see anything. But you probably liked the two of them. They seemed earnest and forthright. But did you hear what they said when they were asked if you saw any bleeding on Mr. Bradley? Mr. Mingle said he was barely bleeding at all. Mr. Riddle said he was bleeding profusely. Is there any question that they were there? Of course not. They were both there. Is there any sense that either one of them is lying? Of course not. It's just not the way human minds work. You could probably think of 100 examples in your daily lives. You could think of multiple examples in this trial. Who remembers what day we went on The View? Who remembers what tie and suit Mr. Byers was wearing when he did his opening? Who remembers what day Judge Locke gave his John Adams speech? Now, some of you may have those minds, and maybe you'll get all of my quiz questions right. But there'll be a number of you who will get them wrong. That doesn't mean you weren't here. That doesn't mean you're lying. It just shows the way human minds work. So when you evaluate Alexander Bradley's testimony, think about the things that he got wrong, because I suggest to you that that's more indicative of his credibility than anything else. And more than anything, think about what Alexander Bradley told you about the murder weapon. Now think about it. Again, it's all how the circumstances of the statement. He knew that the murder weapon had allegedly been recovered. You heard that from Burke Wilcox, you heard that from him, you've seen the news, he said that's not the murder weapon. If you believe Mr. Baez, he keeps calling this the deal of the century. What's the deal of the century? Alexander Bradley was not charged with this crime, he was not held as a suspect in this crime, he was brought up as a witness. The police didn't even know he was the driver. He was brought up as a witness. He was only in custody because he refused to come up. And he knows, again, Mr. Baez's theory that he's supposed to make us happy or make the prosecution happy. Why wouldn't he, if you were really lying, if you were really the killer, why wouldn't he say, oh yeah, Aaron must have taken a gun to his cousin's house and must have gotten to that woman that way? He'd make something up. No, Alexander Bradley stuck to what he believed. He was mistaken. We know the murder weapon wasn't thrown out the window. But doesn't that prove that he's being forthright and honest? Doesn't that prove that the detectives and prosecutors didn't coach him and tell him what to say? Because Alexander Bradley would have every motive in the world to say, oh, yeah, you know what, yeah, I guess I didn't see the murder weapon thrown out the window. But he doesn't do that. The same thing with seeing the victims cross the street. Keep in mind, Alexander Bradley tells you Aaron Hernandez thought they crossed the street as well. That's where he first made him look over. But he tells you, yeah, it looked like them. He's wrong. But again, doesn't that speak volumes? The detectives didn't try to coach him. Prosecutors didn't coach him. He's never changed that story. So there are minor inconsistencies that make him credible. And another thing about Alexander Bradley, didn't he tell you the good, the bad, the ugly? Did he ever seem like he was trying to gild the lily, or he was trying to keep facts from you, or do anything like that? Did he seem like he was trying to hold back? If anything, at times, didn't Alexander Bradley almost seem like you could call him honest to a fault? And what do I mean by that? When I asked him, were you the same Alexander Bradley who was convicted of dealing marijuana back in whatever year? Oh no, that was cocaine. Mr. Baez asked him, wouldn't you call yourself lucky the fact that you haven't been caught more for drug dealing? He said, yeah, I guess I would. When Mr. Baez asked him, isn't drug dealing a violent business sometimes? He said, it can be. Did he ever try to hide those facts? The text messages. How easy would it have been for Alexander Bradley to say, you know, when I'm referencing whatever the guns were that he had, a Mac 11, Mac 9, I was just trying to make him scared. I didn't really have the guns. What did he say when he was asked about it? Yeah, I had those guns. Yeah, I had a bulletproof vest. Again, are these the actions of somebody who's lying? Are these the actions of someone who's trying to curry favor to get the deal of the century? Or are these the statements and actions of somebody who actually told you the truth on a stand? That's up to you to decide. But think about that when you evaluate Alexander Bradley's credibility. And then we get to the independent corroboration of Alexander Bradley. How much independent corroboration is there? There is a ton. The Cure and Tufts video. I know you've watched this a number of times during a trial, but look at Aaron Hernandez's expressions. Right here, coming up. Right there. And what is Alexander Bradley doing? He's doing exactly what he testified to. He's trying to calm him down when they leave 9 minutes after this incident in the club. He's trying to calm him down. Aaron Hernandez is the aggressive one. And then out on the sidewalk, who's the angered one and who's the peacemaker? Look at him. He's throwing his hands down at Hernandez. Alexander Bradley. Hey, you're going to see a lot of this from Alexander Bradley, too. Arms outstretched. And Mr. Bias says we're just asking you to speculate what's being said. No, we're not asking you to speculate. Alexander Bradley told you what's being said. He told you that he's saying to him, listen, you're a professional athlete. You have to stop getting so mad at things. People aren't trying to test you. You got to mellow out. You can almost see the words being said. Look at Alexander Bradley right now. Look, you got to stop doing this. You're a professional athlete. And look at Aaron Hernandez. What is his body posture telling you? He's got his hands on his hips. Look at him right now. He's going like this. That's corroboration of Alexander Bradley. If you do nothing else, when you go back in that jury room, at some point, watch this video from the beginning to the end and watch the expressions. The Tufts video. Ugo Ojimba, we've already talked about that, completely corroborates Alexander Bradley. Very quickly on Ugo Ojimba, the defense wants you to believe that Ugo puts Aaron Hernandez up by the W at 2:30. You heard Ugo's testimony. He said he wasn't sure of the time, and the one key factor for him is he said, I know when I saw him, he was with the same guy he was standing with, so that's Alexander Bradley, so that should tell you a lot. But also, what caught my attention is he was walking in a different direction from where I saw the people I later learned to be the victims. So that proves it didn't happen at 2:30. Mercedes Sanchez and Aquilino Freire. When Alexander Bradley gives his statement, when he says those terrible words that were stated right before the murder shots were fired, when he says, yo, what's up now, the N-word, does Alexander Bradley have any idea that Mercedes Sanchez and Aquilino Freire are going to say the exact same thing? He doesn't even know them, but they corroborate that. Michael Haig. When Alexander Bradley comes into the grand jury, and we went over this to the point where you're probably sick of it, but Alexander Bradley, nor the police detectives, nor anyone involved had any idea what significance 5 shots had. The tattoo artist hadn't been found. There was nothing at all. Alexander Bradley said 5 shots in the grand jury. He initially said, well, maybe 6, because I know I heard the clicking. Then he said, well, 5 or 6, and then he stuck to his memory of 5. No one coached him on that. And the corroboration from Michael Haig is 5 shots he knows were fired. At least 5 shots. He can't say whether or not there were more, but 5 shots is the one thing there's evidence of. Cell towers. We've already gone over that. That completely corroborates Alexander Bradley, not only for the Boston murders, but for Florida. Brooke Wilcox, and this is something I just want to spend a little bit of time on. Again, this goes towards credibility. The defense would probably argue, if they had a chance to get up now and say, Brooke Wilcox, well, she's just going to say what her boyfriend says. Remember, Alexander Bradley says, when I came to see Brooke, I told her that idiot or that crazy person just did some effed up stuff. He just shot 2 people in Boston. That's not what Brooke said. Brooke said something different. Again, that's one of those things that shows credibility. It's a minor inconsistency, but it's important. The computer search, that corroborates what Bradley said. Phone records corroborate what Bradley said. Tanya Singleton, the fact Alexander Bradley told you that, the defendant told him, I'm going to have Tanya clean that car and hide it. That car was cleaned really well on the inside and it was hidden. Tanya Singleton, although she's deceased, corroborated Alexander Bradley's testimony. Jack Fox, we've already gone over that. He corroborates Alexander Bradley. Jeff London corroborates that Aaron Hernandez, prior to 2012, would get upset at clubs. He had arguments with people in clubs. He testified that afterwards he started to do things like get paranoid as far as calling the Fed. Jeff London corroborates Alexander Bradley. Shanna Jenkins Hernandez unintentionally corroborates Alexander Bradley because she too sees a gun at their home at North Attleboro. The Belglade group, we've already gone over those people with all the lack of memory. They corroborate Alexander Bradley. The tattoos. Alexander Bradley has no idea Aaron Hernandez is going to get those tattoo confessions, but he does. And that corroborates Alexander Bradley's 5 shots. It corroborates the fact he was shot. And then the text messages between Mr. Hernandez and Mr. Bradley. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I know you've been listening for a while, but wasn't the case in many ways over the moment you listened to Alexander Bradley read those text messages back and forth? Wasn't there something about those text messages, not only so much of what was said, but what wasn't said in those text messages, that not only spoke to Alexander Bradley's credibility, he never wavered. You shot me. You know what you did. You're going to pay. Over and over again, I know what the car looked like. They have records. They can prove this. I'm not going to the police. It's not what I do. Over and over again, Alexander Bradley being completely consistent with what he's always said. And what about Aaron Hernandez? Does he ever in those text messages, again, explain anything? Like, why didn't you come to the hospital when I got shot? Why doesn't Aaron Hernandez ever say anything about the people who really shot him? Mr. Baez throws out this statement, oh, Alexander Bradley's mad at Aaron Hernandez because Aaron introduced him to the people who shot him. What evidence is there of that? What evidence? Where in the evidence did you see that? These text messages were devastating because they corroborate Alexander Bradley and they show Aaron Hernandez and what he didn't say. And what about this text? He calls him AA. And you may have again thought it wasn't a big part of the case. But remember Alexander Bradley in cross-examination from Mr. Baez. Mr. Baez was saying, oh, well, AA, it must just be because of the 2 A's before your first name. And back and forth between he and Bradley. And then Bradley eventually said, well, all I can tell you is nobody called him AA before the murder. And then he wanted to be called AA after the murder. But guess what? Remember the stipulation that was put in towards the end of the case? And remember my questions of his very best friend from home, Ryan McDonald, who's known him practically his whole life? My questions of Shanna Jenkins Hernandez? They've never heard of him referred to as AA. And that corroborates what Bradley said. But that stipulation, there was at least one other person who heard him referred to as who referred to him as AA after the July 2012 murders. In 2014, I think the evidence was. The defense arguments. And I just want to be very clear on this. The defense, as Judge Locke told you and will tell you again, the defense has absolutely no burden in this case. They don't have to prove or disprove a thing. So what I'm going to talk about now in no way think that I'm suggesting they have to prove a thing. But I do think it's helpful to go through some of the things that Mr. Baez said in his opening statement is what the evidence would show, and it will also dovetail to a lot of what he just said in his closing. D'Abreu and Bradley recognized each other. Really? I would say the defense can be summed up in 2 words. Fertile imagination. What do I mean by that? The most innocent gesture is suddenly turned into reasonable doubt, turned into grand conspiracy. Because Daniel D'Abreu, while he's standing in line, looks over and then looks down. To Mr. Baez, that's proof that Alexander Bradley and Daniel D'Abreu knew each other. Because Alexander Bradley goes like this as he's outside with Aaron Hernandez. He's pointing to Mr. D'Abreu. Really? Is that what the evidence shows at all? No. Bradley had issues with D'Abreu. What part of the evidence suggests that to you? What part of the evidence, besides wild speculation from the defense attorney?
Counsel, may I see both sides?
Just as far as what Mr. Baez just said in his closing, he said that the time frame doesn't make sense, that somehow the witnesses disprove the case. Is that really what the evidence shows? Think about what Mr. Antoine Salvador said and what that proves. Again, nothing was hidden from you. Mr. Salvador's statements essentially were given to you by Jamie Furtado. The timeline still fits. Andrew Wallace said 2:15. The defense suggests that the timeline is destroyed. That's not true. What else did the defense tell you? They told you that this whole investigation was a culture of deception. Is that what you think is from the evidence that you've heard in this case and the witnesses that you've heard? They told you all kinds of things about forensics. He told you a lot about forensics. This is not a forensics case. It's a drive-by shooting. Drive-by shootings don't leave the type of forensics that we're talking about here. Dr. Jamie Downs, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him, but didn't his testimony, the credibility of it, go right out the window when he tells you, I only testify to the truth, and yet then he's drawing a picture of Sfero Furtado holding a gun? He says that that's the anatomical position, someone leaning out the window holding a gun. And what about when he was asked if that wasn't a graze wound on Mr. Ferrier's arm, would that change your opinion? Oh, no, because I have a bunch of other 6 shots. I have multiple 6 shots. Was that credible at all? Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence. Do not be misled by unreasonable or imaginary doubt. Do not engage in the speculation, guesswork, conjecture, and the wild conspiracy theories that are put forth by Mr. Byers in his closing argument. Every little thing turns into something else. Alexander Bradley's engaged in a drug deal. Alexander Bradley's doing this. He's downstairs at Cure in a drug deal when the evidence doesn't support any of that. That is not reasonable doubt. That is unreasonable doubt. That is speculation, conjecture, and guesswork. Follow the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. The word verdict means to speak the truth. Speak the truth through your verdict. You know who committed this crime. The why will never make sense to you. But you know who committed this crime, not from what I tell you or Mr. Byers tells you, but from the evidence. The tattoos. Permanently imprinted on his arm. Permanently imprinted, God forgives. Right above and below, what is he asking God to forgive? The shooting of Alexander Bradley above, the murders of July 2012 below. God forgives. His statements, his words. That is a confession. But this is not a church, this is a courtroom. What matters in this room is the truth. What matters in this room is accountability. What matters in this room is a fair and just verdict based on the evidence and not based on wild speculation, conjecture, and conspiracy theories. It has been 5 years since Sfero Furtado and Daniel D'Abrera were gunned down in cold blood. Their lives matter in this room as well. And what matters in this room is speaking the truth through your verdicts as to who killed those 2 men in cold blood. 5 long years. The time for hiding evidence is over. The time for trying to kill the one eyewitness who can hook you on this is over. The time for those wild conspiracy theories and speculation is over. The time for accountability is right now. His time is right now. Speak the truth through your verdicts and find him guilty.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to recess for lunch. After your lunch, we will have instructions of